Hello and gents, hope you're well, hope you had a fantastic day so far. I had a wonderful conversation with Sandi Marshall this week, and we were able to talk about mental health, my own story a little bit, but also how you can sort of see someone's mental health potential issues, but also some of the mindset stuff that I'm really trying to ground myself in as we go into this more challenging period of time as the recession looks like it's going to take hold at some point very, very soon. So thank you ever so much for coming back and watching. I hope you took value from this conversation. I'll now hand over to Sandi to explain a little bit more about what she does and why she does it.
So my name's Sandi Marshall. My company is Workplace Wellbeing. I'm a mental health advocate. I've been involved in training corporates, mental health awareness, and I'm looking forward at the moment. I'm doing some training myself because I want to go into kind of like dealing more.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for the time. And I think, because I know we met through networking, but I think mental health as a space is so underrepresented sometimes, but also, when I was a kid anyway, it was like this whole, especially as a guy, it was like man up style of conversation, right? But I think just as a base level to kind of get us started into this hopefully really valuable conversation, what's kind of your definition or what's your understanding of the concept of mental health for those who, because everyone has their own definition, right? But I think it's really important to establish what does that mean for you.
I think for me, it is quite simple and very straightforward. Mental health is exactly the same as physical health. We all have physical health. We all have mental health. Sometimes we're in good physical shape. Sometimes we're in good mental shape. Equally, sometimes our bodies break and we need to give them time to repair. Equally, our minds break and we need to give them time to repair. And it really is, to me, that simple. If I broke my leg, I wouldn't ignore it and carry on walking. But if I break my mind, if I break my brain or something causes my brain to break, I'll quite happily sort of like pretend it's not going on and just muddle my way through and hope it gets better. And that's not the way to look at it.
I think, where do you think the misconception or the concept of because for a long time, especially when I was in school, mental health wasn't really a discussion topic. It was kind of this unsaid thing, or especially when I was growing up anyway, it didn't feel like, especially as a guy, it's something you can necessarily discuss. Obviously it's good that it's now coming to more of the forefront and now being talked about, but where do you think that kind of, from your perspective, came from in regards to actually it being discussed, if that makes sense?
I think it was really taboo years ago. There was that kind of man up and get on with it and all that kind of thing. And people just didn't want to talk about their mental health. And I also think that men especially equate mental health issues directly with emotions. And to me, it's slightly different because you can control your emotions to a degree, but you can't control poor mental health. And I think probably COVID and lockdown has done an awful lot to raise awareness and to encourage people to speak out. And I also think there's people like Harold Floyd, Elite Force Safety. You couldn't find a more macho guy. And he's out there and he's teaching people about mental health issues and how to deal with them. And that kind of thing is important. Recently on the news, there was 3 guys walking 300 odd miles in memory of their 3 children, their 3 daughters, who all committed suicide. In fact, that's the politically incorrect term to use. They completed suicide. And that's another thing. I know we're going to go on to that later. But things like suicide was seen as a crime not that many years ago. And that's why people talk about committing suicide in the same way as you would commit a crime. Our whole way of thinking about it all just has to change.
I'll be cautious on what I disclose here for obvious reasons, because part of it's not my story. But I think, my initial touch point with the suicide concept or first being touched by it was really early. And I think, I mean, for those people who haven't been there, because I haven't attempted, but I've been close to. And I'm very open with the fact I have been. And the reason why I'm very open with that is because I feel it's really important to discuss, especially when you're strong enough and you've been through it and you've processed it, to be in a position where you can discuss it, because that's the only way it's going to be kind of, I guess, moved on, or people are going to feel like they can have a conversation about it. But I mean, we can talk from a psychological point of view about what the factors are, but I think that's a bit too clinical. I mean, what, in your experience, have you known of that? Because I think sometimes the misconceptions around suicide is it's a thing of weakness, right? It's a selfish thing to do, right? Whenever I heard about it or heard about people attempting it or unfortunately actually completing it, we'll use the correct politically terminology, they were quote unquote weak, or they were being quote unquote selfish, right? I mean, what would you say, or how would you describe it now with the understanding and the empathy that you have for people who are maybe going through mental health issues or maybe have gone through it? Because I understand where it comes from when people say it is selfish, but also from the same perspective, it's not. It's quite difficult to explain why it's not, but it's not. But
I think
how about you?
actually taking your own life is extraordinarily brave. I think it is the ultimate act of despair. And I've been quite honoured in that I've been able to have conversations with people that have attempted to take their own lives. And the common denominator for me is the absolute belief that all the people that they're leaving behind will be better off when they've gone. That they're not going to leave heartbreak and devastation, that actually it's almost going to be a relief for their nearest and dearest once they've gone. And that people that attempt to take their own life believe that with every single fibre. The same as I believe that if anything happened to me, my kids would be devastated. But it's the reverse. And I think it's extraordinarily sad and very humbling that there are people out there who genuinely believe that their families, their friends, their colleagues will actually have a better life if they're not around.
I mean, you're right, and I can think of a lot of different scenarios where that's true. But I think the suicide end of it is the end of that spectrum, right? So I think let's pull it back, because unfortunately there is going to be people who are going to either try or unfortunately succeed in committing suicide. But if I'm a loved one of one of those people, or I'm someone, a friend, a teacher, a colleague, etc., I guess what are I know the signs are hard to see sometimes, or to believe, but I'll go into my own personal story in a little bit, but I think for me, I think it's important to maybe establish what potentially those signs are, because now, of course, with this being said, not every sign is going to be the same for those people, but what are some of the asterisks this person is having some pain, having some issues, having some concerns that could result or lead on to a more serious scenario?
There's so many, but the trouble is, like you say, it's the subtlety of those signs. With some people, they're not so subtle. One of the common signs is withdrawal. People aren't out and about so much, they're not chatting so much, but then you get other individuals who are incredibly adept at appearing normal. And that is where, I use the word normal loosely, but appearing that there's no change in their personality. And again, that is where, for me, we need to have the conversations. We need to make it, there's the buzz going around, or was going around a little while ago, it's okay not to be okay. And as much as I hate these kind of little cliches, it's right. if somebody isn't feeling okay, we need to make it acceptable for them to say, do you know what, I'm actually not feeling it today. And just being able, because those odd bad days, in my personal experience, they're the days that you might feel a bit off about once a week, and then suddenly it's twice a week, and then like 5 days out of the week you're feeling crap, and it just deteriorates. And it's about, for me, it's about having somebody there to support you in the early stages, so that people don't get to the point where they're so desperate they don't want to be here anymore. And I know that's not always possible. There is no catch-all system. There is nothing, I honestly think, that you can put in place that is going to catch everybody. But we need to do more to support.
And I think, from a psychological point of view, there's a lot of kind of, I mean, talking from personal experience, for me, as someone who was bullied at school, as someone who was picked on, as someone who was belittled a lot of the time, or put in a position of making to feel small, or etc. For me, I wanted to have an escape from that feeling, and hurting myself was a way of getting that sense of closure, sense of feeling, that break, because I had a different, instead of it being emotional pain all the time, it was then physical pain, right? And I get comments, and I get asked quite a lot about my tattoos on my wrists, and the reason why they're there is not a hard one to guess, but for me it was a promise I made to my then 15, 14-year-old self that was actually arguably at the depth of my mental health journey, the worst I've ever been. And this was, and just for the record, this wasn't caused by anyone in Pacific, and it wasn't prevented by anyone in Pacific. Everyone around me who cared about me did the best they could, and all of the factors that led up to it was actually the fact that it was a combination of factors. That's why it led up to it, right? Because what I don't want it to be is a perception of, oh, this person didn't do the good job, or this person, it was just down to this person, because it's actually not. In reality, mental health as a concept, it depends on if we're talking about the clinical depression, which is a different thing to what probably I have, which is reactive depression, which is when a certain amount of things happen, and then a result happens of cause of it. Now, the way I dealt with that at 13, 14, 15, coming on 16, was by self-harm in some ways. And the reason why I made that choice and I made that decision to say enough is enough, there is no actual benefit necessarily in me doing this, excluding, potentially scarring myself or worse. So for me, I wanted to give myself and I said for 3 years before I got my tattoos on my wrists about what that meant. And I think when I announced, I don't know whether you saw the Facebook post when I announced that I had done it, but a lot of feedback kind of came back to me and said, more power to you, Colton, without me saying it. And that was kind of my win from a mental health point of view. It was like, yeah, actually, this is the older me, the person who didn't have those skill sets to push themselves out. And as I say, there's a lot of other factors that, if you know me personally, you'll know, but that's not my place to, they're parts of my story, but they're not my story to tell. So that's where I think it's important sometimes when we talk about our own journeys or our own stories, to be very careful in what we disclose, because we can actually hurt a lot of other people without meaning to by doing that. And I think actually we can, by being an advocate for mental health, which is something I feel I am, and something that, I'm willing to talk about, but that doesn't give me the right to say, hey, I should tell you all of the things that happen, because, as I say, they're not my. Yes, I'm part of that story, but it's not my that bit. Those bits are not part of. They're not my story to tell.
But sometimes I think it's important, like you say, when it's not something specific that puts you in that position, that it is like a whole series of events, or some within your control, some outside of your control. And I do think that to a degree it's important to talk about those without naming names, so that other people recognize that build up themselves. For example, I kind of dropped off the radar a little bit with work and LinkedIn and all the rest of it, because I was going through some crap myself over the past 12 months, 6-12 months. I've got divorced, I've put my house on the market, the sale's fallen through a couple of times. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that have gone on. And again, I'm not going to point the finger of blame at anybody and say my issues are your fault, but people need to understand that what is sometimes seen as common everyday events do have that ability to build up and build up and build up until you get to a point that you can't cope with it. And yeah, the emotional stress that can lead to mental health issues, it can just come from nowhere. It can be, I like the phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back. And yeah, I believe that is a thing, that we all walk around dealing with a certain amount of crap, but sometimes somebody can just put, or something can just put that one little more thing onto you. And then that's it.
And I think, for me, as I've got older and as I've really started to understand, well, firstly, what's happening psychologically to my head when I am feeling down, number one. Number two, I think everyone has to, whether they've had a mental health journey themselves or they know someone who has, or etc., if you want to prevent yourself from having one, or etc., because I don't think anyone's immune to it. I think that we can create scenarios or create things which are more likely to allow us to deal with them when they happen, or kind of release the, I'll use the quick analogy I use. Personally, for me, I always, and I have for this year especially, have grounded myself every day in a exercise of physical health, something related to physical health. It could be something simple like get out of my office and go on a walk, right? It doesn't have to be I do a really intense workout. Sometimes it is I do a really intense workout, but that's not the point. The point is doing something related to physical exercise and something related to mental exercise. So something which is going to release my cortisol level and get it back down to base level. Because part of what we have when we have mental health issues or things that stress or concern us, it could be finance, it could be personal, it could be professional, etc., is actually because our cortisol levels are too high. So we need to have a way to let that go. And one of the ways, actually, the reason why sometimes people have mental health issues or people self-harm, or actually, arguably, why people end up potentially even thinking about suicide and then, unfortunately, taking their own life, is actually because of all that build-up, as we've discussed before.
Just two things to jump in there about. First of all, it's really interesting because a lot of people don't realise that many mental health issues actually come from, or actually born from, a physical health problem, which is the buildup of the cortisol. And like you, when it was first explained to me that my mental health issues was literally a chemical imbalance in my head, I almost felt better about it, because I felt that kind of like woo, crazy thing wasn't going on. There was actually a physical reason why I was feeling the way that I'm feeling, or was feeling. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that we always talk about people with mental health problems or people with mental health issues. I think if everybody was brutally honest with themselves, you would be hard pushed to find anybody that can stand there and say, I've never had an issue with mental health. And again, it goes back to that similarity with physical health. You will never, ever find a person that has never had a physical health problem, whether it be an ingrown toenail, a cold, a broken limb, whatever it is. There's just different levels of physical health problems, and there are different levels of mental health problems. And it's I think it's interesting, again, as I say, because it applies to everybody. All the things that we're talking about apply to everybody. It just applies at a different level.
I was debating whether I wanted to throw this in, but I think I want to mention it. And what I don't want to happen is it to be perceived as I'm an anti-medic kind of person, because I'm not. But I think one needs to appreciate and understand where taking the tablets or taking the medication should be used, in my opinion, right? For me, when you have a form of clinical depression, not the same as reactive depression, which is what I believe I have, there is a level of chemical imbalance in the brain. Probably something similar happens when I have a reactive depressive state. However, the medication or the antidepressants which one would take are the tool that allows you to then fix the problem, right? It's not the solution to the problem, because the issue, in my opinion, is sometimes we get a tablet or we get a fix, and it's not a permanent fix, but we treat it as one, because as humans, we're naturally going to go to the path of least resistance, right? Which is, hey, I feel better by taking this thing, right? Okay, cool. But then you become reliant on said thing. Now, the human body as a concept is an incredibly powerful and incredibly wonderful concept, and a very actually magical in regards to fixing itself. It's the only thing that we know of that can just fix basically everything that's wrong with it if you give it enough time and enough fuel, right? And the thing is that the same is true with mental health. The point of antidepressants is to get you to the point where you can actually mentally deal with whatever trauma is causing the issue. Now, sometimes when we say the word trauma, we think something in our childhood, we think something really drastically wrong. It's not necessarily that. The definition of trauma is something that, from my understanding anyway, is an emotional thing that makes you feel bad, right? So it could be you were bullied at school, it could be you were picked on, it could be you were beaten, it could be etc. All of these things are technically traumatic actors or traumatic things. They're not always the things we would normally associate with trauma, e.g. a sexual abuse or a physical abuse or a emotional or verbal abuse from a young age, from potentially a family member, a friend, etc. But I think that's an important distinction to be made, especially when it comes to medication, because from what I've seen personally anyway, sometimes people take the medication as the solution, which I don't personally believe it can ever be. It is the short-term solution, but the point of it, as I say, just to reiterate, is to get you to the point where you are able to deal with whatever it is, or go through the process of, talking about, looking forward, having some level of conversation related to whatever that traumatic experience is. And just to end the point on, for me, one of the key things I've had from a business growth point of view, but also just from a personal development point of view as well, is having a asterisk coach, a person, whoever that is, you can call them what you like, that you can go to and has a level of intimate understanding of your own process, your own demons, your own struggles, so that they know how to do it. And ideally, this person shouldn't be someone tied necessarily. You'll become friends with them and etc. Right? But what I'm saying is they shouldn't be necessarily directly tied to your day to day, because you sometimes need that level of separation from your inner circle to be able to discuss this thing. Because if you're not in a situation where you feel like there's a high level of judgment, or there potentially could be a high level of judgment, and it's not a safe space, which I don't like the terminology of, but that's a separate conversation. I think it's about having an environment where we have a world, because the reason why I don't like safe space is because it implies that every other space always has judgment around it, which in most cases, I would hope, isn't true, right?
I think
as a final...
Unfortunately, I think in most cases, our perception is that it is true. Because we all, I think society, the media, everything gives us a reason that we all think we're being judged. So I get what you're saying in that it shouldn't be like that. But I think the word safe space currently has a place. because it is somewhere that people need to feel that they're not judged. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be judged everywhere else. But let's face it, when you're walking down the road and people are looking at you, very, very few people think, oh, they're looking at me because I look great. Most people think they're looking at me because they're judging me. And I think that we just kind of like default to that. But going back to the whole medication thing, again, look at it in the same way as we look at physical health. If you have a long-term physical health condition, you may be on long-term medication. In fact, it's likely that you will be. And there are some mental health issues that do require long-term medication. So short-term physical health issues, colds, broken limbs, I know I keep talking about broken limbs and that, but it always seems to me like a really good analogy. So while your limbs are fixing, you're going to be taking painkillers, possibly anti-inflammatories. But once you're fixed, once your legs working again and you've had your physio and everything else, then you're not going to continue to take those tablets. And again, I think it's exactly the same with mental health issues. People are prescribed tablets or medication to help them deal in the short term with what's going on. But what I think we have a real problem with in this country is that we prescribe the tablets to help or to support somebody's mental health, but then we stop. There's very little after that people can go to, very little support that they can find to help them on the rest of that journey. And that is why so many people end up staying on antidepressant medication for such a long time.
I know, there's a couple of things I want to just clarify for the audience sake. There's a difference between a mental illness and a mental health issue, right? A mental illness is an actual illness that should be treated as such. A mental issue is what I would describe as a burn, broken arm, blah, 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 etc. And when I refer to the antidepressant comments earlier, that's what I was referring to. Because mental illness is something that needs to be treated by a case-by-case basis with a very different thing. And that's where you need to, I would actually say, have a professional who's a clinical psychologist or someone who has a clinical degree to be able to help that person. Because you're not dealing with the same rule set, right, as someone who has issues, quote unquote, right? And I want to make sure that the disparity is known. But also, just while you were thinking about when we talk about judgment down the street, something which jumped to mind to me was we hear it a lot about when we start the gym, right? Because one of the common things talked about when one starts the gym is everyone's going to judge me because I can't ego lift or lift as much as everyone else in the gym. Well, of course, you're day 2, right? But in reality, what's actually happening is most people in the gym actually don't really care what you're doing, don't actually have any interest in what you're doing, and they're more focused on what set am I doing next and what's my format, blah, 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 etc. And actually, I would argue people walking around a day-to-day, as humans in most cases, it's very unlikely that someone's going to specifically stare at you and go, oh, their hair's weird, or oh, there's this, or there's that, because they're worried about their own things in their life. 85 to 90% of the time, I don't think they're going, I think about this person, a random stranger down the street. Outside of maybe if I'm trying to walk fast somewhere and they're in the way and they're being slow. Outside of that, but that's just, I want to get round them because I'm trying to get somewhere quickly.
But I think
that's not me judging who they are, right?
As people, I think our perception is that we're being judged. I absolutely agree with you. 90% of the time, we're not. Nobody's taken a blind bit of notice of us. But our perception is that we're being judged. It's funny. You see somebody trip in the street, and that person automatically thinks that everybody that goes is laughing. Thinks it's funny. Where actually a majority of people are thinking, oh my God, I hope that person's okay. And I think our perception is very different to maybe what is.
I mean, it's interesting that you mention that, because we see this when we start creating content with people and we start helping them create content, because one of the common things I ask people all the time, like, oh, I want to be confident on camera. How can you be confident on camera and what you're saying and so on? And the question I normally ask them is, why are you not? Right? Because what are you worried about? And in most cases, it's judgment of friends, family, or I don't know, someone. Right? Of what if I sound like an idiot? What if I do this? What if I do that? The reality of the fact is, in most cases, you're the only one who knows if you went wrong. So unless you make a very clear, obvious, oh, I made a mistake, then no one's going to really realize you made a mistake. Because even if you fully script video, the only people who have access to the video are either the crew, you, or etc. So it doesn't matter. But the point there is, I think sometimes we project, in the analogy you use where someone trips. In reality, I would hope, my hope in humanity is actually most people are thinking, thank God he or she didn't fall on their face and or break their face or bones, legs, arms, etc. And that's why we look, because I think we're naturally wired to want to care, I would hope, right? And when we see someone of injured, and I think this is where the conversation for mental health really, brings up or kind of hums. And I think the crux on I would suggest is we all have instincts around something, especially when you know someone for a long time. Like the classic when I was growing up was, yes, I'm fine, even though I'm not, but I don't feel comfortable enough to have this conversation, or etc. Or the classic, wife says I'm fine, oh God, what have you done? Right? Kind of thing. But I think for me, if your instinct says and you know the person, right? If it's a friend of yours or someone you've worked with for a long time, you'll know whether they're actually saying genuinely, I'm fine, or whether they're saying I'm fine, asterisk. Right? And I think it's up to the instinct of that person to then see in the scenario which they're talking about, is it appropriate for them to have a conversation? Or do you make a mental note to later on, hey, do you want to go get a beer? Or hey, do you want to go get a coffee? Or whatever your, thing to do is, to then actually on a one-on-one basis, maybe, test that I'm fine concept. And I think if you genuinely care about your co-workers, your friends, your etc., and or your fellow human, I would hope that you would potentially go out of your way and deal with that kind of uncomfortable conversation, because naturally we don't like that uncomfortable conversation, right? But as I said earlier, as humans, we will naturally go towards the path of least resistance in most cases, unless you train yourself to go towards the path of most resistance, which actually I would argue there's most reward in there. But the benefit from a mental health point of view is if you do push towards that, you're then more likely to actually really find out, because then you're moving them into a different mindset, or you're putting them in a situation where they're going to feel closer to a safe space, or they're going to feel more comfortable or safer to really. And worst case scenario, you find out actually they're fine and you just end up having a coffee with someone. Great, fantastic. Best case scenario, or worst case scenario, depending on how you think about it, the floodgates actually open, right? But then you've benefited, then both have benefited, right? Because you can put your mind to ease if it's not that. And if it is, then, you're clearly wanting to be there for that person by inviting them to this one-to-one interaction.
I think that's another reason why, my business, when I set it up, Workplace Wellbeing, it is important that people in the working environment learn to recognise and understand the range of symptoms that can occur along with a mental health issue. And so many of those are misconstrued. Things like productivity. Somebody's productivity drops for no apparent reason. To me, straight away, that would be like alarm bells. And I would be saying to this person, checking in with them, and it could be something relatively minor, like a disagreement with their partner in the morning, and it's rumbling on for a little while. But equally, it could be something really important. And very often, making changes to the workplace for that individual for a period of time. I'll give you an example. When I worked as a manager in the bus industry, one of my drivers, fantastic records, brilliant driving record, brilliant attendance record. And suddenly he started missing days, coming in late. He had a couple of accidents, and everything just kind of went a bit haywire. So I stopped him, I had a chat with him, and we were talking, and it turned out his son was seriously ill and had been in hospital, but he thought he could manage that with all his work. And anyway, long story short, we ended up changing his shifts for him so that he could get to visiting hours. He did some longer days, and then he did some shorter days so that he could spend more time with the rest of the family, supporting them. And they got through it. Luckily, his son recovered, fit and well. And we still had this guy working for us, and increased loyalty, if you like, because we'd been there to like support him when he was going through a tough time. So there is an awful lot out there that employers can do to support people that have mental health issues or are going through some kind of trauma that can lead to a mental health issue.
And I remember writing about might have been about a month ago at the time of recording about some people really seeing the financial burden or the financial pressure of our current situation. And the crux of the point why I wrote it was that people need to appreciate or understand that those people, if they are under financial concern, stress, etc., they're going to have different problems. They're going to react differently. They're going to be slightly more snappy. They're going to be more stressed. They're going to react differently. And in a situation like that, that's when you should be empathetic and compassionate more than, no, he was really mean, because you need to imagine what would happen if you were in that scenario, because it's very possible you could be in the next 3 months, right? But I think the key point there is, and I'm conscious of time, so I think let's wrap up soon, but the crux is actually if most people had a high level of empathy, and because I think sometimes with mental health, especially if you have never really had what I would describe as an episode of deep mental health concern, it's quite difficult to empathize, right? One of the, I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks back about, would I change who I am? Would I change what I've gone through, etc.? And I said no, because it allows me to fully understand and fully appreciate what I actually have, and allows me to be grateful every day for what I have, because I know what it's like at the opposite end, right? If you don't know what it's like at the bottom, you can't know what it's like being happy and etc., right? You can't know that.
Again, I sorry to interrupt, but again, I would bring that back to physical health. Sometimes it's hard for people to empathize with somebody that's got a bad back because they can't see it, they can't feel it. But it's there and it's constant. And I think we need to understand that you can't always see somebody's issues.
Yeah, and I, especially on a mental health point of view, as I say, like building off what I was discussing in regards to the financial issue, not everyone's gonna say, "Hey, I'm struggling financially," or etc., right? Because of that judgment, because of that this, etc. But also, I think there's a level, especially in the entrepreneur world, where you have to trust in yourself. Because the thing is, like, a lot of us are freelance and we'll take the work when we get it, and we don't actually have a secure quote unquote revenue stream, right? Unless you've got retainers and you build systems to build that. But in most cases you don't. And you need to be able to understand and appreciate and believe that the work will come, even though you don't know where that's going to come from. And, especially in a month like August, which has been categorically known for a long time to be quite challenging for a lot of people because of multitude of reasons, people going on holiday, kids being about, etc. Things related to business don't necessarily move forward at the same pace they usually do. And for me, I think it's about firstly trusting that September, October, yes, we're looking at some stuff that's probably quite challenging, but there will still be opportunities. But also, it's about developing strategies and plans when you're in that non-busy period to what can you do so that when, we're in September, what have I done during the last month to actually really push myself into a position of authority and or develop new strategies, new principles, new things that I can add to my toolkit to market or sell. And I think for me, that's where the important steps really design. And the only way you can do that is by having a grasp on your own mental health, of course. But also I think it's where the kind of sitting down and really being trusting in yourself where you can really lean into it, because I think it's notoriously important for you to believe that it's going to be fine. Because all that happens if you don't is you go on this constant spiral of, oh, it's not going to be, oh, I'm going to lose this, oh, I'm going to lose the business I've built after, etc. And that's arguably more dangerous than the reality, which is we're having an off month because everyone's on holiday and everyone's with their kids.
But I agree, but I also think that that's where the people around you, it's not always easy to have that clarity. And I think, again, going back to the whole mental health issue, that's where people around you need to be supportive. They need to be empathetic. And one word that we haven't used here that is extraordinarily important to me, and I think we don't use it or practice it enough, is kindness. Just sometimes just simple things, a simple acts of kindness, and not something that you necessarily have to go out of your way to do. It is enough to just show somebody that, do you know what, all's not lost. To restore somebody's faith in humanity, in life, in whatever. And yeah, I think sometimes we need to, I mean, everybody talks about like seeing the bigger picture, and it's great. If you can do that, it's absolutely great. But people that are just going from day to day, we have to remember that sometimes it's the tiniest things, it's the small things that will make the biggest difference. And yeah, for me, that is hugely important.
I think that's a really important point. That might be something simple like saying thank you to the server, or smiling at the person, or etc. And these are things that cost nothing, right? Because I think sometimes when we think about all these kind things, it means I have to give to charity, or it means I have to buy my friend something, or etc. Not necessarily. And at the end of the day, actually, spending time with the people you care about is actually probably the more valuable thing you can do. So I think if anyone's going to take anything from this, it's about understanding where you sit mental health-wise, and then understanding what you need potentially if you were on dicier ground, and develop either strategies or people or both that can help you get back or nurture you back to the better version of yourself, or the best version of yourself, which for me, I think is something which I always try to leverage and talk about, is having a place where you can talk about it. And this podcast is a good example, but also privately as well, to go into more depth and say, look, I get that because I've gone through this, or hey, this is how I overcame this. Or we saw it a lot in the pandemic, because people weren't necessarily in the same boat. We were all in the same storm, but we weren't all in the same boat necessarily, because there's a lot of our businesses that if you're in a restaurant, you're probably hit harder than I was, for example, right? But I think for me, it's about, as I say, being compassionate, being kind, being empathetic to everyone else around, especially as we move into this next climate age of recession, etc. Because there is going to be people who are genuinely nice people, but they are slightly more on edge because of a financial concern, because of a health concern, because of so on. Because, especially as business owners, we've built these things, and especially if it's a financial thing, it might feel like their business is about to fall off a cliff. And it actually might be. But it also, in the same way, also might not. It might just feel that way. So I think for me, that's what I would always recommend people do, is try to be empathetic and compassionate where they can, because that will go really far.
And I think as well, being compassionate and kind when you yourself are at a point where you're struggling. When I was going through everything, I'm a huge believer in random acts of kindness. And I would go out of my way sometimes just to do something kind for somebody else, because do you know what? Actually, that gave me a really nice feeling. When I got that reaction from somebody being surprised, happy, whatever it was, from something that I'd done, even if it was like something tiny, it just made me feel really nice. And to me, at the end of the day, mental health, it's a huge subject. But the thing to remember is that we all need to look out for each other.
I completely agree. And I think it's something which we're going to have to continue to do more of. And, you know, thank you for the time for having this conversation. But for those people who have really took value from this conversation and maybe they want to connect with you or they want to continue this conversation outside of this piece of content, where's best for them to
connect with me through LinkedIn. I'm up on LinkedIn. I've been off of it for a little while. I haven't completely ignored it. But over the next few months, I'm planning to get sort of more involved again. Might even resurrect Wellbeing Wednesday in the new year. You never know. But yes, anybody wants to connect, wants to chat, then look me up on LinkedIn and send me a request. And yeah, we'll have a good old chinwag.
Thank you for coming back, ladies and gents. I hope you took value from this episode. If you did, then I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section down below. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode as well. I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to hear how video can help your business in 2022, then feel free to find my information somewhere around this video. And I will see you very, very soon.